my sister didn't mention she wasn't coming.
So this one was a little bit difficult for me.
No.
It was intense. I don't know how we can get more intense than the one on the Holocaust, the representation of the Akedah in the Holocaust, but somehow, maybe because somehow this hit very close to home for me. So be prepared. You know, in the past, together, we've broached the topic of chronicling or writing about death as an act of sanctification. You know, the writing of it, the glorifying of it as a way of lending meaning, especially when it seemed counterintuitive, you know, to us that people should be writing so glowingly of death, like as they did during the Crusade era in the Middle Ages. We've discussed that representing death as sacrifice made it as if it was part of some kind of plan, religiously meaningful, not a random act, you know, but something that was saving or redemptive, consecrated. And this kind of sacrificial discourse that Jews, for example, used in the Middle Ages created an image of a holy community doing what it was doing for a specific purpose. So, welcome everybody. Hi. Here, we can just pass these down. Pass these out. Pass out.
Pass out.
Good. Here we go. So we're talking again about this notion of writing about death as an act of lending meaning to that death. And so today I would like to look at a few examples where this sacrificial discourse that we've discussed in the Middle Ages was in some ways revived, on the one hand revived, and on the other hand completely and outrightly rejected or even completely overturned in the Jewish national narrative in Israeli literature. Okay, so we're discussing as I called it on the sheets, the Akedah through the ages, Isaac in Israel. Okay, so something that we've been trying to get to, but I always run over time, so we never get to it. So we're discussing the Akedah in Israeli and Zionist literature. I have to start off by saying I have to kind of like give you a caveat. It's a thorny, it's a very fraught kind of picture that we get of the Israeli relationship with the Akedah. The Akedah was an extremely fraught and complicated thing in Israeli culture. On the one hand, so I'm going to kind of like lay it out like Tevye would do in Fiddler on the Roof. On the one hand, on the other hand, some writers of Zionist literature, many of whom experienced horrific persecution, either during the pogroms of the 1880s or the Shoah or whatnot, either firsthand, secondhand, the children of people who had experienced suffering and persecution. Some of them linked the Holocaust to the founding of the State of Israel. The victims of the Holocaust as sacrifices were connected to the victimization of those who fell in battle, right, for the State of Israel. So in that sense, Isaac and the Zionist pioneers were tragic victims of their circumstances. So that was kind of one thing that you get, this notion of victimhood. They're both victims. But more so, on the other hand, other Zionists, especially like very pioneering activists, transformed the Akedah in their writing to be a symbol of activism. They preferred to view Isaac not as a victim, a hapless victim of circumstance, but a willing, active, volitional sacrifice or martyr, right? So like Jews who suffered during the Crusades, like them who took Isaac and made Isaac a volitional kind of character with intentionality, opting for this and saying, I want this, I want to be a sacrifice for God, taking matters into his own hands and saying, I'm deciding my fate, nobody's deciding my fate for me. This group of writers and this group of thinkers did the same thing, whether they knew they were doing the same thing as the Jews in the Middle Ages or not. Consciously or unconsciously, they were doing that. They saw that they represented themselves and they saw themselves as determining their own fate, either for life or for death. And they were this holy kind of martyrological, noble society, endeavoring towards what Derrida, famous theorist or postmodern thinker, would call the gift of death. Okay, death was Derrida, D-E-R-R-I-D-A. Derrida was spoke about death and martyrdom. Here, we can just pass these out. I'm sorry. Just pass these down. Okay. As a kind of a gift, something that you can aspire to, especially if you're doing it for a noble cause. And in this case, the Akedah, these people use the Akedah in a treasured kind of way, as a treasured part of their heritage. They wanted to keep that symbol of the Akedah, similarly to the Jews of yesteryear, to lend a kind of national cultural air of sanctity. And Isaac is recast in accordance with this new Zionist ideal as having no semblance of victimhood, only having martyrological, volitional, active significance.
That was like the Masada, right?
It could be, although the Masada people don't, as far as I can recall,
Not only in relation to the Akedah, but
right, yes,
volitional.
definitely. Taking matters into our own hands. Nobody's determining our fate for us.
And
so Isaac is that kind of figure in that sense, in how they're using it. And then, of course, we have the Zionists, or the writers or thinkers, hard to categorize them in terms of their Zionism, who didn't want to relate, who to this day do not want to relate to the Akedah at all, who completely reject and overturn the Akedah. These are could also be survivors of the Shoah, who view the Jews of yesteryear as, whether it's the medieval Jews or their parents or their grandparents or the shtetl or whoever, as sheep to the slaughter, passive sheep to the slaughter, who died gratuitously, who died as hapless victims in the pogroms or in the Shoah, who were clinging to old mythological stories of the Akedah in order to lend their lives meaning, but it's ridiculous. It's a myth. Death, any semblance of death is bad. They have no allegiance to these old kind of images. They want to create a completely new Jew, right? A strapping, vital man or woman who's not a victim at all, doesn't have this image of being a victim, but being a strong, an image of strength, vital. And they wanted to create their own kind of meaning, their own kind of language. They didn't want to cling to these old kinds of images. And in this case, it became super complicated. And in this third kind of writer and thinker who wanted to reject the old, out with the old and in with the new, they would either use the Akedah in a new kind of way, thinking they were using it in a new kind of way, although they were kind of, again, doing what Jews did in the Middle Ages, distancing themselves from the past and not realizing that they were actually using it very similarly. And they were completely overturning what the Akedah was. The Akedah is now about Jewish volition and Jews deciding what they're going to do, like what I was talking about in the second category of thinkers. Again, the heroism in that sense was a little bit different. Isaac is not dying for God, right? Isaac is not dying for religious purposes. Isaac is dying for the state. Isaac is dying for political purposes or some other kind of ideological purposes. But the Akedah was still used similarly in order to represent a kind of noble death, a volitional, volunteered noble death. Or they would invoke the Akedah dafka to overturn it, dafka to reject it, to say it's a mistake. There's nothing holy in it. There's nothing great in Abraham willing to sacrifice his son to an inscrutable God who potentially is unethical himself, right? If a God asks for that God is unethical. They might say our parents' glorification of the Akedah is, it scares us, it plagues our nightmares, it's something terrible, it's something that we don't want to be around us. We don't want our parents to be talking about an Akedah, with us, or with themselves or whatever, that they're great Abrahams or something. We don't want any of that. Or they say it's downright demonic and it needs to cease right now. No more Akedot. Okay, all this war, this kind of pacifism. And this is really representative of, associated with the left, Amos Oz, that kind of thinker. And in a lot of these cases, when they write about the Akedah, intergenerational conflict is projected onto the Akedah. This kind of conflict between the father and the son. It's a conflict, right? Which you don't see really in the Psukim at all, except for the fact that at the end they leave alone, right? So you get the sense that there's not as much togetherness. But what the Zionists or the Israeli writers insert is a real conflict. A real misunderstanding of each other, talking past each other, not being able to partake of each other's experiences in any meaningful way, not being able to relate to each other, and sometimes even hating each other. They speak about, they reinsert the banished brother Yishmael, right? Whereas Yishmael, they really want to overturn this whole thing, that this is not the only son who the father should love. There are other sons who the father should love, right? They talk about the absent mother. Where's the mother? Why isn't she protecting her child? Those kind of things. So the Akedah is really reimagines to have all these kind of conflicts and hostilities within it. So we really see in the end, that the Akedah is used by writers around the founding of the State of Israel and beyond, used by Israeli society to really understand itself. As it goes through like kind of this existential crisis of trying to understand itself, how do they relate to the images of their tradition, to the myth of the Akedah? Is it something that they want to grab onto and hold onto and maintain in some way, or is it something they completely want to distance themselves from? Yeah.
Have you heard anything like with the very contemporary tragedies that are happening in Israel? Have you heard any of that language?
So it's very interesting. My husband has spoken in shul many times using the Akedah imagery, and I'm just very sensitive to it. And we've both thought that somebody should kind of like do a study on how the Akedah is used either by rabbis, I'm sure it's invoked a lot of time, and also in the media. I do see a lot of Akedah imagery. I saw it with the three boys, invoked all over the place.
But not by the parents.
I don't remember if it was by the parents, but it's not only in the media. I saw it in the media. I see it. There's also this kind of sacrificial imagery in jihadi literature also, but it's not. It wasn't only the media. I'm trying to recall. I think one of the boys' fathers did, not Gilad. So there was, yeah.
Because I
If I'm recalling correctly.
remember reading Rabbi Gordis
Yeah.
many years ago when there were all these suicide bombings happening in Jerusalem, and I think because the jihadists so much sacrificed themselves by killing them, they used that
Yes.
imagery so much
Mm-hmm.
that I think, from what I read from him, he was trying to explain. He said to his son, like, that we don't have this child sacrifice. I think in contrast, it's interesting because maybe they've monopolized that imagery, by just sacrificing themselves, by blowing themselves up, and that I think they anyway pulled away and said we don't have this sense of you have to die to sacrifice.
Right, and also
yourself.
I don't think that the image that was promoted was one of glorification of that death. It was again kind of like this was not for naught kind of thing, or just this is a circumstance. This is a state of being that we are akedot. Like it's just what happens to us. Whether we like it or not, kind of thing, and it should bring us together. It should have some kind of positive ramification. Not that we would choose for this to happen so that these positive outcomes result, but it is something that unites us. That we are, unfortunately, over and over and over again, the akedot, the sacrifices.
The interesting thing is that it
But
did
you
not
could
bring
also-
Abraham
you
and
could
Yitzchak
also-
together.
Right.
It was
Right.
the opposite result,
Right.
really.
Right. And Elie Wiesel talks about the trauma of that. But, right, so the Akedah becomes kind of like, and we'll see, especially towards the end, like post-1967 and the Lebanon War in the 1980s, that it becomes kind of a catch-all. You can project anything onto the Akedah. And we can't just react to, let's say, what jihadis are writing about, right? And say, oh, then we're not going to do that. Like if that's what they're doing, we're not going to co-opt that imagery, because they also have so many things like that we wouldn't be able to talk about anything. In other words, there are certain times where the Islamic media, whatever, talks about suicide bombing as a birth and a rebirth or a wedding, right? There's one that comes to mind where a reporter writes about a specific suicide bomber, a woman, a female. She gave birth by blowing herself up, and like as her like organs came out of her, she was giving birth to the Palestinian people. Like the birth pangs. So what I like was like very, very descriptive, right? And they have like wedding ceremonies where they marry off the shaheed, like they marry off the martyrs to women and whatever things like. So it's like we can never talk about a rebirth of how not the same way, not to say that we're blowing ourselves up, but what you can co-opt, they co-opt things,
them,
we
yeah.
can,
I guess
then where do you stop?
Is b'diavad l'chadchila.
Right.
That's the only
Right.
difference.
Right. And it's hard to say like what you do to lend meaning if you don't want to do that, right? So like if you're not going to use Akedah imagery, what do? Then it's very depressing. Then it's just a random act of nothingness.
Right, I guess you use the word akedot, like
Right.
it's saying these were 3 akedot.
Right.
Already, you don't need to say more.
Right.
Like that's, the language, the word
Right,
is
it's
so
very,
powerful
very
that
powerful.
you're done.
Yeah, and that's definitely what I want to bring out here, and I want to go through 8 poems if we can, where there's a very big semantic tension. Like you say the word Akedah in a poem, and you have to ask: is the poet trying to say something about a victim, or something about a hero, about a survivor, about a conflict? Like what is? There's so many things that could be involved in that word that you have to try to figure it out each time. Yeah.
Julie, I'm just afraid that we won't have time at the end
No.
for me to ask this question, which is a burning question.
Yes.
Since you've devoted so much of your time, effort, and energy to the Akedah, have you come out with the end result in your own mind religiously that the Akedah was something, the sacrifice of Yitzchak was something that Hashem wanted or Hashem didn't want?
So maybe we'll discuss my personal
No, I know.
approach.
I'm just afraid there won't be time.
Well, we do have time. But let's make sure we get to other people's approaches first, because I'm a nobody. I don't matter. But I want to put your attention, just try to encapsulate it, try to get it in 45 minutes. I want to put your attention to 2 trends that we see in the recasting of the Akedah and in Israeli literature. The first is the secularization of the Akedah. Okay, so that's the first one we're going to look at, and the second one is we're going to look at protests against the Akedah, revolting against the Akedah. And I'll start just with a non-Jewish poem, actually, with a poem called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. If you've ever heard of Wilson Owen, a well-known anti-war poet who wrote immediately in the aftermath of World War I, how he experiences the horrific trenches of World War I. And this poem sarcastically points a blaming finger at Abraham. We'll just read the end. He basically summarizes the whole Genesis 22 story, and then he says, the angel comes and says, "Stay your hand, Abraham, don't kill Isaac." But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one, right? So this is a sarcastic kind of comment on the gratuitous war of World War I, the horrific circumstances, the negative use of the biblical trope to say this is unacceptable, that Europe is sacrificing its children, actually sacrificing its children. And he represents kind of a major turning point in the European approach to war and the sacrificial ethos and sacrificial discourse. Post-World War I, people were saying no more. Like this was for naught. Like this was just ridiculous, and it can't ever happen again. In the face of such tremendous misery that they encountered, they decided like there's no silver lining. Like this has to stop. No matter which way you turn it, it's bad, right? But we find that it's a little bit more nuanced in one part of the world, post-World War I, in Palestine, what was then referred to as Palestine, where this notion of a noble death was not completely written off. So rather than dispensing with it, they wrestle with how the Akedah, or this notion of a noble death, would apply to them. And that's probably because they're not thinking about a kind of gratuitous war. They're thinking about a war that has like ideological meaning, religious meaning, meaning in terms of heritage and culture. This is a different kind of war that they're fighting, a different battle that the early founders of the state are fighting, different than World War I. And so they're not completely keen on abandoning and rejecting all notion of a noble death. So we'll read some poems from that era. The first one is called Yerusha, okay? And you can read a little bit in English, a little bit in Hebrew. Ha'ayu ba'acharon v'lo yada Avraham kihu v'yeshiv al she'elat ha'yeled v'shit ono b'eit yomo arav. I want you to point, the ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question. First of his strength when his day was on the wane. Nasaro hashov, the old man raised his head. Biroto kilo chalam chalom v'hamalach nitzav. Nashra ha'ma'achelet miyado. The knife, the ma'achelet, and that's the same word used in the Akedah, slipped from his hands. Okay? The boy, released from his bond, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what pleasure had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts, right? So we have like the crux of the poem where it says Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed, right? So nothing physically, allegedly nothing physical happens to Isaac, but the trauma is the Yerusha of his descendants. The trauma, the knife, the rest of his descendants are born with a knife in their heart. So the poet suggests that, you know, all children of Israel were born with some vestige of this eternal wounds, you know, that Isaac experienced, an ingrained relic for millennia, since the time of the Akedah, with pogroms culminating in the Holocaust and potentially going on through the founding of the state of Israel. So the son physically evades death, but it's not a trauma averted. Trauma is still there, and it has yet to be seen if, you know, future generations are going to be able to release themselves from what is seemingly an unending trauma. You know, so it's not like he's dispensing with the Akedah. The Akedah is still there, but the Akedah is clearly
Shira Galvin, Abby Goldberg, please come to the front office.
the next one I want to point your attention to is called Al Hayeled Avram. Okay, this is pretty crazy. This is
Mrs. Lerner's
written in
student, she took a test yesterday, 10th grade,
and it's a reaction
test of
to a
Mrs.
newspaper
Lerner.
article,
You can meet me outside Ms. F's
which
office
was
if you want to get your
talking
test
about
back.
a child,
10th grade,
a
Mrs.
survivor,
Lerner's
child
test being given
survivor
out
of the
outside Ms. F's
Holocaust
office.
who was sleeping in a stairwell. I mean, this really, it was describing in actual circumstances, a little boy who was refusing to sleep in his bed because he was claiming he heard the voice of his parents in his bed and he doesn't want to go to bed. You know, and so it was trying to describe the trauma that, you know, that people were experiencing, the post dramatic stress disorder. So he was afraid to go to bed because he was hearing the voices of his murdered parents. So Natan Alterman wrote a poem, you know, about this boy, kind of dramatizing. And in the poem, you know, we'll just read a little bit. A Polish city, a high moon, and as always, sailing clouds. At nightfall, the boy Avram lies on the stone steps of the house. Nearby, his mother stands over him, and her feet do not touch the ground. And he says, Avram, the night is cold and wet. Come home to your waiting bed. Okay? And Avram replies, my mother, I shall not sleep in a bed like other children, for I have seen you there. My mother, asleep with a slaughtering knife in your heart. So it's the mother who has the ma'achelet in her heart. It's the mother who has been sacrificed, right? The mother is the Akedah, so to speak. Then his father stands and reaches out to the boy and scolds him, transparent and tall, and says to him, Avram, come home now, my son Avram, hurry home, right? So his father has a more scolding voice. The mother was kind of offering him some kind of redemption. This is your home, come to your bed, come home where things are comfy, cozy. And his father is saying, you know, come home now.
Tally Kupferman, grade 12, please come up to Mrs. Vito. Talia Kupferman.
And Avram replies, my father, there I fear to close my eyes, for I have seen you there, my father, sleeping still with no head on your shoulders. Then his little sister stands before him and calls him home in tears, and Avram replies, there you sleep with tears of the dead on your cheek. Then before him the 70 nations of the world say, we are here upon you with 70 harsh laws and 70 axes. To this house we shall return you. His mother calls out, if it wasn't for the slaughtering knife in my heart would break in two. And then saying, do not fear, Abraham, for I will make your name great. Go through a night, lech lecha, go through a night of butchery and blood to the land which I will show you. So this is very much, you know, the words, it's like the founding of the state of Israel becomes a divine command, just like lech lecha. And it uses the words lech lecha, derech lo ma'achelet v'dam.
Sarah Rogers.
Go to the land where I will show you. The same language
Scratch
that God uses of the
Together.
Torah to Avram is used to this little boy to go to the land where I will show you, go to your homeland, right? So it echoes the divine command. It's the political mandate to found the state of Israel is a divine command, right? It echoes the divine command. And Abraham was afraid, and he fell on his face, and he left his home and gate, for the command that thundered over Abraham, the father thunders over Abraham, the boy, right? So the Akedah there is manifested in the Akedah here. So the boy is led from kind of the knife of the Holocaust to the Zionist redemption. He's told by divine command to go through a night of butchery and find his homeland, right? So we have, again, Akedah imagery, but also saying that butchery is happening. You know, it's not the Akedah where the child is spared. It's not the Akedah where the parent is completely and utterly spared either. There's very little heroism here, per se, but there's definitely divinity and meaning, right, to this thing. A third poem I'd like to bring your attention to is the poem Yitzchak by Amir Gilboa. And we'll just listen to it here for a moment.
יצחק, אמיר גלבוע. לפנות בוקר תילה שמש בתוך היער, יחד עמי ועם אבא, וימיני בשמאלו. גברת להבה מאכלת בין העצים, ואני ירא כל כך את פחד עיניים מול דם הלהלים. אבא, אבא, מהר בהציל את יצחק, ולא יחסר איש בסעודת הצהריים. זה אני הנשחט בני, וכבר דמי על העלים, ואבא נסתם קולו, ופניו חיוורים. ורציתי לצעוק, מפרפר לו להאמין, וקורע העיניים, ונתעוררתי, ואזלת דם הייתה יד ימין.
Okay, so we start with kind of like this pastoral kind of imagery. This was written in 1953, so post-founding. The poet is Isaac here. The poet is talking about his own reminiscing, you know, maybe in the forests, in the woods of Europe, right? And he's walking with his father. They get up early in the morning, Vayishkem Avraham Baboker, just like Abraham did in the Akedah. He refers to his father lovingly, calls him Abba rather than Avi, right? My father, which is a kind of like a more formal way of putting it. He refers to him as daddy, and this is from a child's perspective. It's a very placid kind of beginning. The father and son are walking in the woods, and there's a surrealism here that the son is walking with them, and it's, you know, idyllic European childhood, and then suddenly we're plunged into this like milieu of sacrifice and Holocaust, right? He sees like lightning, a knife flamed between the trees, right? And the trees also, the Eitzim, invokes this image of the wood that Yitzchak was carrying, you know, the Eitz, the Ma'achelet, the knife, right? It's lahava, it's flaming, so it's very suddenly very, very scary. The child is terrified. You know, so the sentence is always garbled. You know, I fear so the terror of my eyes facing blood on the leaves. What is that? You know, like it's not even like a complete sentence. You know, and the child in his kind of like naivete, you know, invokes lunch. Like we want to have a nice lunch, kind of thing. Like what is this? You know, kind of thing. He tries to go almost like bring it back to the natural setting. This notion of like we're here, we're family, we're here to have lunch, we're here to have a picnic. He wants to like move away from this whole hullabaloo and torture. So the reader is kind of left on a pendulum swaying back and forth between like this idyllic, nice setting and this horrific, murderous setting. Like we might say the murderous versus the mundane. Right, in this poem. So the child has like this kind of like naive response to we don't want to miss the noon meal. We don't want anything to happen. And again, we don't really see any executioner here. We don't know why there's this knife in the middle of the trees. It's kind of a nameless executioner. And then we have the voice of the voice of the dead father, I guess. Maybe, you know, it is I who am being slaughtered, my son. You know, in a very kind of factual way. It almost swings us back. Those lines swing us back to the biblical setting. My blood is on the leaves. My father's voice was stifled and his face pale, right? The father is dead, right, at that point, and he wants to cry out, but he's stifled like his father. His father's voice was stifled, but his voice is stifled too. Writhing not to believe. I want to escape. I don't want to believe this. I want to free myself from this like unendurable nightmare, from this memory. I'm crying. I'm trying to get away from it and tearing open my eyes to get, you know, maybe closed his eyes to escape this nightmare, but you know, his eyes are torn open. His eyes are focusing on it anyway. And I woke up, and bloodless was my right hand, and the word for bloodless is azlat dam, right? Hayita yad yamin. Azlat dam is like a, you know, kind of like a poet. It means like a helplessness, you know, a limp hand, or it's a poetic construction based on like a common idiom, azlat dam. Literally, it means like scarcity of hands, like weakness, right, of hands, helplessness. He awakens to find that he had been, held close to his father, who's like corpse-like at this point, and he can't escape. He can't escape the past. It's brought into his present reality. He's in a helpless situation, a helplessness, a helpless spilling of blood. So it's a very heavy kind of thing. How the Akedah is actually playing into this, it's a question of Jewish identity. Is this something that he's like honing in on as a cherished kind of image? It's just what it is. It's just the experience that he has. He has the experience of Akedah, There's this transgenerational killing, which is interesting. He's not the Yitzchak directly, the one who's actually dead. It's the physical sacrifices across multiple generations, but obviously he feels the ramifications of it, the unending ramifications of it. Maybe there's some guilty feelings here for his slaughtered father. There's a helplessness. There's a role reversal, maybe due to the Holocaust, right? Maybe the Nazi massacres can't be construed as a trial of faith like the Akedah could be. Now it's just a nightmare. It's not like the night of faith or anything like that. Abraham is a noble knight of faith. It's just a nightmare. An inescapable nightmare. Yes.
And the fact that even the second paragraph,
Yes.
Intersperses that horrificness in between the idyllic mundane.
Yes.
Makes it feel like it's inevitable.
Like you must just be walking in the woods and then there's a clap of thunder or a knife in the middle of the trees.
And that this is a way of life. I mean,
Right.
This
Right. It's
is
just
life.
integrated
It's just
into.
integrated, yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty evocative. Then we have a very famous one, On a Night of Raining Yerushalayim in Jerusalem, written in 1954 by Uritzky Greenberg, this is really characterizes the loaded nationalistic nature of Greenberg's poetry. Where can we read? I'll do it on here also, and then we'll just skip around like we did before.
What year did you say this was?
1954.
54.
Maybe not. Okay. Yes. We can read along in the English.
בליל גשם בירושלים, אורי צבי גרינברג. עצי מעט בחצר הומים כעצי יער, כבדי נהרות עננים מורעמים, מלאכי השלום למרשות ילדיי, בהמיית העצים וחשרת הגשמים. בחוץ ירושלים, עיר מסד עוד האב, ועקדת בנו באחד ההרים. האש משחרית עוד דולקת בהר, הגשמים לא חיבוה, אש בין הבדרים. אם אל יצווני כעת כשציווה לאבי הקדמון, אציית בוודאי רן ליבי ובשרי. בליל הגשם הזה, ומלאכי השלום למרשותי ילדיי. מה מאוד, מה משל לזה רגש פלאי, חי מקדם שחרית עד כעת אל הרמור. מתרונן דם הברית, בגוף אב תפילי, נכון לקורבן הר הבית עם אור. בחוץ ירושלים, בהמיית הצייה, שכרתום האויבים בה מכל הדורות. עננים כבדי נהרות, במרקים ורעמים שהם לי בליל גשם, בשורות מפי הגבורה עד סוף הדורות.
So to some extent, this also has the mundane or deceptive maybe opening. Right? The children are like secure in bed, protected by angels, but there's a very heavy storm outside. Right? It's a very tumultuous setting outside in the beginning. And then the next three verses kind of focus on the biblical story of the Akedah. Right? The Akedah is a paradigm to be emulated. He says, El El yitzavuni k'eit kishetziva lavia kamon tzayit b'vadai, right? If God commands me now as he commanded my ancient father, I should surely obey. So there's this notion that I would obey, right? It's a paradigm to be emulated. It's a model that we should, it's a model for behavior. If God demanded it, I would do it. B'vadai, for sure. So the poet here identifies with that event. It's wholly committed to it and all its ramifications. There's no hesitation and no doubt here. And this is, Ernst V. Greenberg. This is patriotic. This is nationalism. But it's a secularized Akedah. It's obedience to the state. It's doing God is to some extent the state here. And he links towards the end from the mouth from the last sentence. From the mouth of the Almighty till the end of the generations, he links the past and the future for all eternity. He ties the Jewish people inextricably to the covenant and all the implications of the Akedah story. So he fully accepts the Akedah story here as it relates to the founding of the Jewish state and the protection and defense of the Jewish state. So these are just some poems, I think, that we can point to that really transform the Akedah into a secular concept having to do with statehood and founding of the state. We see that the Akedah obviously continues to serve as an archetype in this secular poetry. And within its context, we see the Akedah transformed secularly in a few ways. The relationship between man and God, which is in the biblical story, is replaced with a lot of things. It's replaced with now the relationship between man and nature, right? The woods, the storm outside, right? You're walking through the woods and suddenly nature turns on you, right? There's a knife, a gleaming knife in the middle of the trees, or a raging storm outside, right? So there's this conflict between man and nature. Man and the state obviously sacrifices here of the youth. The eternal sacrifice is not for God, but it becomes for other purposes, for the state. The death of the hero enables the society to go on as it should. Man and his own historical heritage, the Akedah, these poets wrestle with how much are we accepting our history as part of ourselves? How much are we saying, no, we don't want our history to be part of ourselves? Here, for the most part of these poems, they say we do. It's part of who we are. It's part of our circumstances. It's part of what makes us the Jewish people, and we're just going to have a knife in our heart forever. That's just who we are. It's part of our identity, Or they're harnessing, like Ernst V. Greenberg, harnessing the Akedah as a trope that is cherished and continues to endure. And then there's also man and his own fate. It's a way of talking about the Akedah is a way of talking about shared fate, that we're a collective, that we're in this together, not necessarily as God's people, but as pioneers, as builders, as soldiers, as creators, as establishers, and the Akedah becomes a kind of forum for talking about all of those things. Again, not necessarily commitment to God, a knight of faith, as Kierkegaard would have it, but I don't know, a soldier of faith, a contributor, a citizen of faith. And that's what we see in these poems here in the early part of the relationship between the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
I just have to ask you.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't want to rush, but what is the refrain, the angels of peace are at the head of my children's bed? What could that mean?
Yeah, so the angels of peace, the Malachei HaSharet, they're there and that's a good thing. Yeah, they're protecting my children. So you have this nice thing, just like in the other poem, they're walking through the woods, this nice thing, but there's a storm outside, There's this conflict between the everyday and what we know is a threat, all the time looming over us, So, yeah, definitely we see that. And then we have this kind of rage, and besides for the secularization, the secularized version of the Akedah, we have mostly post-1967 a rage against the Akedah, a revolt against the Akedah. We start to see a transition to a different attitude in 1967, when for the first time, the founders of the State of Israel are too old to fight, right? They're not fighting themselves anymore. They're in post-independence, right? And they're not in, they fought the War of Independence, but they're not fighting anymore, and they're sending their children, another generation off to war, and their children don't want to have as much to do with it as they do. Their children, still the Akedah is going to remain a powerful symbol, but it's going to be a much more fraught symbol, and, well, it was fraught before, but a harsher thing to contend with, And there's gonna, the writings in post-1967 have a more ambivalent kind of valence. And just there's one little excerpt here that's not a poem that I put on here from a collection of war interviews, of post-1967 war interviews, where you see doubts about the Akedah creeping in, where the Akedah is this myth that people want nothing to do with. This father says, "We do knowingly bring our boys up to volunteer for combat units. These are moments when a man is given a greater insight into Isaac's sacrifice, when we send our boys off to war," right? Kierkegaard asked what Abraham did that night. What did he think about? He had a whole night to think. It's a question that touches on the very meaning of human existence. And we know that Kierkegaard said he was a knight of faith and he was thinking about how committed to God I am. I am. I've decided I am. The Bible says nothing about that, right? Though for us, that night lasted 6 days, right? When we're asking ourselves, do we want this? Like maybe we don't, right? And that's too much for people to have to wrestle with for that long. So we're seeing a slow evolution towards doubt with the Akedah. That this is too much for people to handle. And it's this poem that really did me in when I first encountered it. This poem is very, very interesting. Avi hayakar ta'amod al afirai, right? My dear father, when you stand on my grave, okay? This poem is from 1970, so it's 3 years after the 6-Day War. And this poem is from a theater production by Habima Theater, called, the production was called Malkat HaAmbatya, which was written by Hanoch Levine, Queen of the Bath. And it deals with a son's contempt for his parents. That's what the general play was about, okay? An intergenerational conflict. And there, inside that play, there was a passage called the Akedah, okay? Where Abraham and Isaac engage in a dialogue where they convey, where there's conveyed deep disdain for parents who see themselves as sacrifices. The son is saying, "You're not a sacrifice, I'm the sacrifice." Okay, in this passage, right, the son is saying, "You're not sacrificing nothing, you're sacrificing me," right? And this poem is right after that Akedah dialogue. This is kind of the capstone to the whole Akedah dialogue. And in this poem, a fallen soldier is addressing his father from the grave. Okay, we're not gonna read all of it, but I do want you to hear a haunting version of this poem, of this song from the 1970 production. By the way, it didn't last long. It was very, very controversial, and it only lasted 19 performances, and then it was run out of the theater. I can't get this out of my head. This is really the crux right here.
על קברי זקן ועייף ומאוד ערירי ותראה איך טומנים את גופי באפר בקש אז ממני סליחה אבי
I think the music sounded happier than the words. Like if you weren't listening to the words, the music sounded, it was weird. I don't think the music. I don't think the music. I thought the music had like more of a
Matter of
tempo.
upbeat or
yeah.
matter of fact?
I
Or
don't know.
upbeat, actually upbeat?
I didn't think the tune matched the words.
Right.
I thought
It's
it'd be
funny
more
that it's
dirge-like.
1970 though.
Yeah.
Like I would have thought at that time there was still like great pride in this, it was post 67, not
Right.
post 73. So it seems like almost premature that there
Right,
was
I
this
think
feeling.
that at that point there was just, so there is a euphoria and post, right, you know, in 1967 there was, but afterwards it seemed like this was never ending, you know, and there was a lot lost, there's any loss is a lot, and
But the victory is becoming Pyrrhic already, because then you're
Yeah.
having all the missiles coming from Egypt that the Soviets presided, so it was in vain a sacrifice.
right, I mean, the Lebanon war, like, it's during the Lebanon war that it really becomes like, yeah,
Right.
where people are like, this is
Well,
enough.
maybe though you said it closed after 19 performances, so maybe there was some people that
Right.
felt this way, but the
Absolutely.
community was. I'm sure now.
Right.
It was
Israel
fun.
would feel
But there was
like
a lot more of this also. I wouldn't say,
Uh-huh.
you know, it's hard to know exactly what the overriding kind of sentiment was. I mean, the criticism of this won out. But there was much more of this. Maybe it's also interesting to think of the demographic, like who it's coming from. Like, you know, the artists are the leftists who are saying enough of this, you know, and other people are saying something else. But this is definitely a blunt criticism of like this blind kind of patriotism, and you know the Senate saying you should feel guilty. You know the thing. Don't say that you did some noble thing. Don't call it a sacrifice. The thing that you sacrificed is me. You know, and you have to apologize to me for it. It's interesting in terms of the music. I'm not sure. I guess it's subjective. It does. It has a kind of like 1970s like classic rock also like ding 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 ding
Yeah,
ding
just
ding
kinda,
ding
yeah, right.
ding
It
ding 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 ding.
draws you in and it
Yeah.
keeps you.
Yeah, I guess that's just, I don't know, how different people see it different ways, yeah.
I think I'm missing something. Is the poet here saying that we shouldn't be fighting these wars?
Yeah.
We should not, we should just give Israel up?
I don't think he's going into details, but he's saying these, at the very least, he's saying we're not glorifying these sacrifices. This is not noble.
Was it worth
You're not doing something wonderful.
If you're saying
oh, I'm
it's not worth
Abraham.
it, that means we
Right.
don't have the state of Israel.
Maybe that far. Some people would go that far. Absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely the left, you know? It's an image of a land that devours its people. That's what it is. There's nothing, no images of the wonders of this land. It's a land that's killing its children. It's Saturn devouring its children as an image of, you know,
So the
image of
parallel
that,
that
you know?
you're trying to show is that it's not acceptable to this son, even if his
Yes.
father's proud of it,
Right.
just like it shouldn't have been
And its
acceptable to
father,
Abraham.
right. Right, exactly. And also like his father, when he's talking to his father is probably somebody who fought in the War of Independence, right? So it was at that time where they were talking more about, you know, this is part of our existence, this is our heritage, the Akedah is part of our heritage, you know? A sad part, you know, it's a knife in our heart that we take with us, and then the next generation says, I'm not taking no knife in my heart anymore, enough. You know,
But then
there's
no
nothing
Israel.
noble about, right, and it's not worth it, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to be devoured.
Or at least don't feel like the father had seemingly was proud that his son fought. Like
Right.
maybe
Right, he
that's
says,
what
don't
he
think of this as our
resented.
noble thing, don't talk all high and mighty, he says, because right now I'm very low.
Right,
Right,
and you're
he
not,
makes that contrast.
you're not the sacrifice I am.
Right, so, yeah. And, you know, so I mean, it's just, that's what we see as we go on. We see it getting even more intensified. In the next poem by Yehuda Amichai, Hagibor Ha'amiti Shel Akedah, the true hero of the Akedah, is very, very interesting. This is 1982, so it's the year of the Lebanon War, very controversial war, and he says a lot of very critical things. He speaks of this whole thing as a plot, like almost as a governmental plot to kill the children. Invoking, it's almost reminiscent of the Wilfred Owen poem, right? That Europe's killing all its children. He speaks of it in kind of that way. He says, Hagibor Amiti Shel Akedah haya ha'ayil. It was the ram, okay? Which is very interesting, kind of sarcastic. He's going to talk about the ram as being this wonderful, wonderful hero, which is almost a sarcastic kind of thing. He's taking something very mundane, and he personifies it, and he said, oh, the ram. He volunteers himself. He's so glorious. He's talking very, very sarcastically. And he says, Shelo yada al ha-plunya bein ha'acherim, who did not know about the pact amongst the others. This ram didn't know that there was a pact, that there was this, conspiracy for him to die, right? Who kamo hit nadev, it was just like he volunteered for it. And we know that an ayil, a ram, can't volunteer. There's no volunteerism, right? Lamut bimkom Yitzchak, to die instead of Yitzchak. And the ram is almost in this poem, not almost. The ram are the people who die, right? Are the youths that we're sending off to war. We're treating them like they're animals, like they're nothing, right? And we say, oh, they volunteer. It's almost like they're these glorious volunteers. But youth, like rams, can't volunteer. They don't have the ability to volunteer and know what they're getting into, right? And meanwhile, all the adults are having this conspiracy to send them off and oh, you guys are such great volunteers. Yeah, like the ram was a great volunteer. It's extremely sarcastic and disconcerting kind of personification of the ram. It's a volunteerism that's imposed upon them. He says, it was as if he volunteers them. I want to sing for him, right? He says, oh, these glorious rams, right? I want to sing for them memorial songs about their curly wool and their mortal eyes and the horns that stood silent on their head, on the living head, of the ram, after the slaughter, that were made into shofarim, right? So the shofar of the ram was made, in the biblical story, according to the Midrashim, was made into the ram that we use on Rosh Hashanah, the ram of redemption. We take these children and we create out of them, we derive from them these glorious myths about redemption and about atonement and whatever. We blow their shofar, we sing their praises during the year to make celebrations, but these are vulgar celebrations, is what he's trying to say. To blast the sound of their wars and to sound the blast of their base, vulgar celebrations. And then he says, I want to remember that final image. Like a pretty photograph in a fancy magazine. So he gets very, almost obscene. There's something obscene. He's setting people up like in a fancy magazine. He's doing a photography shoot, right? We're presenting these people. We're exploiting them, right? We put them in fashion magazines. We hold them up and we put the angel over here, you stand here, and Isaac over here. We put them in beautiful clothes and we say, look at this beautiful image, right? Hatzair, Hashazuf, he's tanned, right? We take the biggest supermodel to be Yitzchak Mufunak B'Gadav Hamagun Darim. ולידו מלאך הלבוש שמלת משי ארוכה לקבלת פנים חגיגית, ושניהם בעיניים ריקות מביטים את שני מקומות ריקים. So we put them side by side. The angel looks so beautiful, festive, long silk robes, the two of them with desolate eyes looking out to distant desolate places. We pose our children, right? We put them there, and we put them in fancy clothes. We put them in these sahal uniforms, right? And we say, look at them, you look pristine. You're doing a noble thing, and your volunteerism is wonderful, right? And we pose them, but they're just standing off. They don't know what's happening. They don't know about this conspiracy, and they're just look off into the distance, unbeknownst, what's really happening.
I picture that image that you projected on the screen.
Yes.
Is it Rembrandt of Abraham looking
Yes.
to the angel,
Yes.
but not
Yes.
to his son?
Right. And maybe if they looked into each other's eyes,
Right.
they would see, they would connect in some way, and
Yeah.
they wouldn't have this disjointed kind of right, cognitive dissonance or whatever it is.
Mm.
Behind them, a colorful background, the ram entangled in a thicket before the slaughter, the thicket, his final friends, right? The ram is like an anti-hero. The traditional heroes are Abraham and Isaac, right? But here he says the ram is the hero because the ram here is symbolic and representative of the youth that we're sending off to slaughter, that can't choose and don't know what's going on. The angel departed homewards, Isaac departed homewards, and Abraham and God had parted ways a while back, but the true hero of the Akedah was the ram. So this is part of a general trend at this time to counteract the drama of the Akedah with this anticlimactic, banal image, of quote-unquote heroes, all these heroes that we're upholding, right? So, and these heroes, he's saying, are not heroes out of purposeful action, out of any kind of volunteerism, that they're passive, they're confronted with the situation, the situation is imposed upon them, and this ram is a metaphor for innocent youths. And it's interesting because we get back to that notion of like sheep to the slaughter, right? The ram, the sheep, right? It's sheep to the slaughter. Literally a sheep to the slaughter. The children, we, the people who fought the War of Independence, we came, or our parents came from the Shoah, right? And we didn't want to be sheep to the slaughter, right? We wanted to be active pioneers, and the Akedah for us was about activism, right? And taking the state by its horns or whatever. And now we're doing with our children, though, we're taking them like sheep to the slaughter. You know, they're not the active pioneers. Maybe it's because of these feelings of just like, you know, it's enough, you know. And then just the last one that we have over here is called Isaac the Idiot. Okay? Mitum Tam Hazeh Yitzchak. And just in this poem, we don't have that much time. Maybe we'll just read it quickly in English. For years, I followed all my father's actions. We were told to stay alert. The tongues they spoke weren't clear. He worked like a donkey, like an ass, and I sat on the woodpile. Only one thing I always concealed. My father was completely ignorant of my military experience. So there's a distance between the father and son. The son is distant from the father. The father doesn't know that the son doesn't know anything about the son's military experience. And sometimes I wrote poems against the sacrifice, against the Akedah, and against the fathers. I remember nights of coughing. He'd rub warm oil in my chest and back, which he'd soothe with cotton, and wrapped in a sheet and blanket, he'd take me out into the yard. So the father was loving, right, in this sense. In this story, the father is not doing something, is not sending the child out to the slaughter purposefully. It's a loving father, but there's some distance, like what you were talking about in the painting, that they're not looking at each other, right? His father doesn't know things about him. The son hides things from his father. The father doesn't. We'll see. The father doesn't speak the same language as him. The father speaks, the language of yesteryear, Yiddish or German or whatever. The father never served in the army. The speaker has hidden from his father his military experiences. So there's a very big distance here. And then he says, to this very day I remember his knees, his soft hands, the crown of the mulberry in the dark, and the lullaby he'd sing in his soft voice. So the father is a loving father without words because of the tongues they spoke. In other words, they speak different languages. So I didn't really understand my father. I felt my father's love. I felt my father singing me lullabies and wrapping me and taking care of me and making me warm and cozy. But I wasn't understanding what my father was actually saying when he was singing those lullabies. I, for my part, while my father is singing me lullabies and saying, no, it's going to be okay, I'm going to protect you and I love you and everything is fine, I, on the other hand, had a completely different world happening inside of me, right? I had a storm inside of me. I, for my part, was scared to die, right? And that they wouldn't draft me in the army. These two kind of conflicting things. The culture is such that it's part of the natural experience of the youth of Israel to go into the army, right? So I was scared that they wouldn't draft me. I wanted to be drafted, but I was also scared that I would die. These two kind of conflicting, this tension within me. And he'd tell me in a voice brimming with love, don't be scared, here I am, my son Isaac. And the boy coughed and burned and said, who are you? And the man answered with a slight foreign accent, I won't let them, my son, take you. I'm the ram, I'm the angel, I'm your father. So the father claims here that he can protect his son, right? I'm the ram, I go in your stead. If anybody's going to die, it's me, says the father, right? I'm the angel who's going to say, stay your hand, don't kill the son, right? But the speaker knows it's not true. The father doesn't understand. The father doesn't understand the dangers here. The father is distant, right? He can't understand. The father is deluded into thinking that there's no danger, that everything's okay, that he can protect his son, and he vows to protect him, right? He doesn't realize how powerless he is. So the parents here, in this poem, parents aren't crazy murderers like in the last one, right? That you have to feel guilty because you're the one sending me off to the war. The father is not a murderer, not saying you're going off to war, even if it means your death, so be it. There's not that kind of anger here, but it's a softer kind of comment on the delusion of the parents. That you think that that nothing bad can happen, but very, very terrible things can happen. You don't know anything, right? You didn't serve in the wars. You speak a completely different language. You don't know this specific circumstance, this specific culture, this specific society that you're putting me in. You know. So the father again doesn't represent the oppressive Israeli state, but the day-to-day parent who loves their children and doesn't really understand what they're doing by putting their children in these specific circumstances. The son says to the father, who are you? Like, I don't know you, you don't know me, we're two separate beings that kind of almost can't relate to each other, you know? So that's a little bit of a more nuanced look. That specific one, does it say on it?
Yeah.
I don't exactly remember, but it's pretty late. It's pretty late. So there's definitely this kind of raging against the Akedah there. I'm trying to see if I have in my notes what year it was, and I don't, right? So there's, this is about a breach between the father and the son. So just to kind of wrap up, we see from this that there was, number one, real tension in the Zionist literature between victimization, this notion of being a victim, and being a hero, victimization versus heroism. Both of those notions, being a victim and being a hero, was connoted in this all-encompassing word, Akedah, or this all-encompassing image of the Akedah. Kind of became a catch-all for any ideological stance that you wanted to take. Whether you wanted to be connected to the Jewish heritage or you didn't want to be connected to the Jewish heritage, if you wanted to make a political statement, you wanted to make a religious statement, you wanted to make a cultural statement, the Akedah was the catch-all for all of that. You want to talk about intergenerational conflict, there was the Akedah, right? So it was a very, very powerful semantic tension with that word. And the Zionists and the Israeli writers were literally having a conversation and a confrontation with Parshat Vayera. That's what they do. That's what they were doing. They just had this massive tension with the parsha in Bereshit, and they expanded the Akedah way beyond the text that we started this whole series with. Another interesting notion that I just want to bring to your attention, just very cursorily, is the fact that as we go on in the poetry, and we're talking about the father and the son more and more and more, we come to a kind of Christianized notion of what the Akedah is, the father who sacrifices his son, the holy son, who is sacrificed. And this is something that was runs against our grain, because the original story is not about sacrifice, it's an anti-sacrificial story. So this notion of the Akedah fulfilled, right, the fulfillment of the Akedah, where the father sacrifices the son, and it's redemptive in some way, and these kind of things, which we saw in the Jewish sources earlier on, is revived in a very poignant way in the literature coming out of Israel. So we've been on a very long journey together. We looked at philosophical conundrums, right? We looked at ancient and medieval exegesis on the Akedah. We looked at Holocaust literature. We looked at the Akedah in art. And we looked at Isaac in Israel. And we can see, to a large extent, that the Akedah lives on, right? It's a kind of like eternal thing, and its various permutations. It goes on and on and on, and maybe even to this very day, I would say that it does go on to this very day. But lecture series on the Akedah do not go on forever. So I would just end by thanking you for studying with me, for letting me learn from you. And I hope we have the opportunity to learn together again in some other forms.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein.
Yes.